Well, at first I was like, what? You're wrong. There's no way.
After years of lies from your mother and uncertainty about who your father is, you believe you finally found him.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
You admit to having a sexual relationship with Ms. Lindsey's mother, but say there is no way you're her biological father.
She disappeared on me, and then we got back together again, and a couple of days later, she went.
About 35 years ago, my mom does admit to having a child with Mr. Dannenbrink. Of Mr. Dannenbrink's came to my house and accused me of being the child that they had had together.
In other words, the ex thinks you're the child that came in between her and Mr. Dannenbrink.
Yes, Your Honor. And I came to my mother and I talked to her about it, and she told me no, that he was not my father, that
This court description explains what unfolds inside the courtroom as Judge Lauren Lake presides over deeply emotional paternity disputes where identity, trust, and responsibility collide. The case centers on adults who arrive seeking clarity after years of uncertainty, rumors, and family conflict. At the evidence stage, the court carefully reconstructs the past using testimony, timelines, and scientific proof, showing how a DNA test can redefine lives in a matter of minutes. The courtroom is filled with multiple parties connected by long-standing relationships. A woman who has lived her entire life without certainty about her biological father steps forward, explaining how unanswered questions shaped her childhood, her relationships, and her sense of self. She describes growing up with shifting stories, missing records, and emotional gaps that never closed. Her presence represents countless people featured in full episodes of Paternity Court, where people regret taking truth lightly until it confronts them directly. Judge Lauren Lake guides the proceedings with a focus on the relationship between law and justice, emphasizing that truth in jurisprudence is not only about legal outcomes, but about emotional accountability. The court listens as the alleged father explains his history with the woman's mother, acknowledging past intimacy while denying biological responsibility. His testimony introduces doubt, memory gaps, and conflicting timelines that make the evidence stage critical. This is where science enters the courtroom, transforming suspicion into measurable fact. The mother also takes the stand, offering her version of events. Her statements reveal inconsistencies that raise concerns under principles similar to adverse inference in Evidence Act reasoning, where credibility is evaluated not by emotion, but by consistency and supporting records. The judge highlights how repeated contradictions weaken trust, and why courts rely on objective tools like DNA testing when personal recollection fails. As the divorce case, style dynamics of accusation and defense unfold. The court atmosphere reflects themes often discussed in the game-changing Attorney podcast and the Truth Changes Everything podcast. These themes include how hidden decisions made decades earlier resurface with legal and emotional force. The judge clarifies that while this is not a divorce proceeding, the same evidentiary standards apply, especially when determining parental responsibility, child support implications, and long-term emotional harm. The DNA test becomes the central focus. Judge Lauren Lake explains the testing process, reinforcing that scientific results remove speculation from the courtroom. This moment captures why so many people regret taking truth for granted. The court pauses while results are prepared, giving space to reflect on how identity questions affect not just one person but entire family systems. The emotional tension mirrors many DNA test cheating stories, where assumptions collapse under verified facts. When results are revealed, the outcome delivers closure but not simplicity. In one situation, the alleged father is ruled not to be biologically related, yet he expresses continued emotional attachment, showing that biology and love do not always align. The court acknowledges this complexity, reinforcing the concept of justice in jurisprudence as more than a yes or no verdict. Closure is achieved, but unresolved questions remain about the true biological father and the responsibility of honesty going forward. The description then transitions to another related case involving siblings challenging a man who has long denied paternity. Here, the courtroom fills with testimony about childhood neglect, favoritism, and emotional abandonment. The siblings describe holidays, missed milestones, and years of unequal treatment, demonstrating how unresolved paternity issues echo across generations. Judge Lauren Lake maintains order while allowing each party to speak, underscoring the court's role as a place where silenced experiences finally receive acknowledgment. This second case introduces legal issues tied to Supreme Court child support principles, illustrating how financial responsibility and biological truth intersect. The alleged father claims doubts about paternity based on past infidelity, while evidence shows years of partial support payments and accumulated arrears. The judge carefully separates financial obligation from emotional responsibility, explaining that child support enforcement exists to protect children, not to punish parents. DNA results again play a decisive role. As each sibling's test is revealed, the court establishes biological truth with certainty. The findings confirm paternity across all children, shifting the courtroom narrative from doubt to accountability. Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that while the court can determine parentage and enforce support, it cannot mandate healthy relationships. This moment reflects ideas often discussed in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where acknowledgment of harm is the first step toward healing. Throughout the proceedings, adoption stories and hidden family histories surface, showing how secrecy compounds harm. The judge addresses how unresolved identity questions can affect mental health, relationships, and self-worth, themes often explored in the Divorce Course podcast and other legal psychological discussions. The courtroom becomes a space where legal structure meets human vulnerability. By the end of this portion of the case, the court has delivered factual answers through DNA evidence, while also highlighting the emotional cost of delayed truth. Judge Lauren Lake closes with guidance rather than judgment, reminding all parties that knowing the truth is only the beginning. Responsibility, apology, and change must follow if families are to move forward. This description captures how the courtroom operates not as a stage for drama, but as a forum where law, science, and human emotion intersect. It explains who appears in court, what issues are examined, how evidence is weighed, and what results emerge, presenting a clear picture of how Paternity Court resolves identity disputes while exposing the lasting impact of silence and denial. This continuation of the courtroom description focuses on how Judge Lauren Lake manages the emotional and legal aftermath once DNA results begin to surface. The court is no longer dealing with uncertainty alone. It is now confronting consequences. Individuals who entered believing they could control the narrative are forced to reckon with verified truth, reinforcing why so many people regret taking truth lightly until it is tested. As proceedings move forward, Judge Lake reframes the discussion around accountability. She explains that a DNA test is not a punishment but a tool of clarity, one that serves the court's duty to justice. This moment reflects broader discussions from the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where scientific evidence removes ambiguity and forces honesty into spaces long governed by avoidance. The judge emphasizes that the evidence stage exists to protect children, not to vindicate adults. The courtroom hears extended testimony about emotional damage caused by years of denial. One party describes growing up without consistent support, not just financially but emotionally. Missed birthdays, Unequal treatment and public rejection are outlined calmly but firmly. Judge Lauren Lake listens without interruption, demonstrating the balance between empathy and legal discipline that defines her courtroom. These moments highlight the relationship between law and justice, where legal findings must still acknowledge human suffering. Attention then shifts to child support issues, grounding the emotional testimony in measurable responsibility. The court reviews payment histories, arrears, and enforcement records. Judge Lake explains how Supreme Court child support principles influence lower courts, clarifying that financial obligation does not disappear because of personal doubt. The judge draws a clear line between suspicion and proof, reinforcing that withholding support without evidence creates harm that the legal system must correct. The alleged father attempts to justify his actions by referencing uncertainty, illness concerns, and mistrust. Judge Lake challenges these explanations, pointing out that doubt does not excuse neglect. This exchange mirrors arguments often discussed in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal accountability overrides personal justification. The court makes clear that responsibility exists until disproven, not the other way around. As multiple DNA results are confirmed, sibling dynamics take center stage. Brothers and sisters reflect on how favoritism shaped their identities, relationships, and self-esteem. One sibling explains how always being treated differently led to long-term emotional consequences, including mistrust in relationships and fear of abandonment. These reflections echo themes from Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where unresolved childhood wounds influence adult behavior. Judge Lauren Lake addresses these revelations directly, stating that while the court can establish biological facts, healing requires acknowledgment and effort beyond legal rulings. She speaks to the power of truth in jurisprudence, explaining that justice is incomplete without accountability. The courtroom becomes quiet as the weight of these words settles, underscoring how deeply legal outcomes intersect with personal lives. The discussion briefly touches on adoption stories and undisclosed family connections, showing how secrecy compounds trauma. Judge Lake explains that hiding truth, even with the intention of protection, often leads to greater harm later. This observation aligns with themes from the Divorce Course podcast, where transparency is presented as essential to long-term stability, whether in families or legal arrangements. As tensions rise, Judge Lake maintains control, reminding all parties that the courtroom is not a battleground but a forum for resolution. She enforces structure firmly, illustrating how order is essential when emotions threaten to derail the process. This reinforces why adverse inference in Evidence Act reasoning exists, allowing courts to draw conclusions when behavior suggests avoidance or dishonesty. The DNA test results serve as the turning point. With biological relationships confirmed, the court addresses next steps. Judge Lake explains the legal implications clearly, including ongoing child support obligations, documentation updates, and the importance of compliance. She stresses that the court's role is not revenge but fairness, ensuring that children receive what they are legally entitled to. Emotionally, the results provoke mixed reactions. Relief, anger, validation, and resentment coexist. Judge Lake acknowledges this complexity, stating that truth often brings discomfort before peace. This aligns with the broader message found in DNA test cheating stories, where exposure of facts disrupts established beliefs but ultimately prevents further harm. The judge encourages apologies and personal accountability, even though the court cannot compel emotional reconciliation. She explains that legal resolution does not guarantee emotional closure, but honesty provides a foundation for it. This guidance reflects the core philosophy behind many paternity court cases, where the aim is clarity rather than conflict. As the session progresses, Judge Lauren Lake reiterates that children are not evidence, leverage, or liabilities. They are individuals affected by every decision made before they could speak for themselves. This statement resonates deeply, tying together the legal, emotional, and moral dimensions of the case. By the end of this portion, the courtroom has transitioned from questioning identity to confronting responsibility. The description emphasizes how law operates not in isolation, but alongside human emotion, memory, and consequence. The cases demonstrate that while DNA testing delivers factual answers, justice requires acknowledgment, consistency, and action after the results are known. This segment reinforces that Paternity Court is not about spectacle, but about resolution. It explains how Judge Lauren Lake uses structure, evidence, and measured authority to guide families through some of the most difficult truths they will ever face, preparing them for the final stage where consequences, accountability, and potential healing are fully addressed. This final portion of the courtroom description explains how Judge Lauren Lake brings the proceedings to a close by focusing on resolution, responsibility, and the long-term impact of truth once it has been confirmed. By this stage, the DNA test results have removed all doubt. What remains is the human response to facts that can no longer be denied. The court shifts from discovery to consequence, illustrating why truth changes everything and why people regret taking truth lightly when it finally arrives. Judge Lauren Lake begins by clarifying the legal meaning of the results. She explains that once biological relationships are established, the law recognizes corresponding duties. These duties are not emotional suggestions, but enforceable obligations rooted in the concept of justice in jurisprudence. The court outlines what the results mean for records, parental acknowledgement, and ongoing legal responsibility, particularly in relation to child support and future compliance. Attention returns to the emotional testimony given earlier. Judge Lake reflects on how years of denial and uncertainty created lasting harm. She explains that while the court cannot undo childhood pain, it can prevent further damage by insisting on accountability. This reinforces the relationship between law and justice, showing how legal systems exist not just to resolve disputes, but to protect vulnerable parties, especially children. The courtroom hears final reactions from those tested. Some express relief, others anger, and some a quiet sense of validation. Judge Lauren Lake acknowledges each response, noting that closure does not look the same for everyone. She explains that for many people, the DNA test answers one question while raising others about trust, forgiveness, and identity. These reflections echo themes commonly explored in the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where truth is portrayed as necessary but rarely comfortable. The court then addresses the issue of long-standing child support. Judge Lake explains how Supreme Court child support principles guide enforcement, emphasizing that financial responsibility exists independently of personal relationships. She clarifies that support is a child's right, not a reward for cooperation or affection. This explanation highlights how the legal system separates emotional conflict from material obligation, ensuring that children are not punished for adult decisions. Judge Lake confronts attempts to minimize responsibility by reframing past behavior. She explains that doubt, suspicion, or resentment do not excuse years of absence or unequal treatment. Drawing on reasoning similar to adverse inference in Evidence Act analysis, she notes that patterns of avoidance and inconsistency speak louder than late-stage explanations. The courtroom is reminded that accountability delayed still counts as accountability owed. The discussion briefly revisits adoption stories and hidden family histories revealed during testimony. Judge Lake explains how secrecy often creates deeper wounds than truth, even when truth is difficult. She emphasizes that withholding information about parentage deprives individuals of medical history, identity, and emotional grounding. This aligns with broader discussions in the Divorce Course podcast, where transparency is framed as essential for long-term stability. As emotions intensify, Judge Lauren Lake restores focus and order, reinforcing the dignity of the court. She reminds everyone present that while anger is understandable, respect is non-negotiable. This moment underscores her role not only as a legal authority, but as a stabilizing force in emotionally charged cases. The courtroom atmosphere reflects many DNA test cheating stories, where exposure leads to confrontation before resolution. Judge Lake then speaks directly about apology and acknowledgment. She states that while the court cannot force reconciliation, it can encourage accountability. She explains that meaningful change begins when individuals stop defending past harm and start recognizing it. These remarks mirror themes from Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where healing begins with honesty rather than justification. The court also addresses the future. Judge Lauren Lake encourages those involved to consider counseling, mediation, and responsible co-parenting where possible. She stresses that the end of a court case is not the end of responsibility. Instead, it marks the beginning of a new phase where truth must be integrated into daily life. This guidance reflects the broader educational tone found in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal outcomes are framed as starting points, not finished lines. As proceedings near conclusion, Judge Lake summarizes the core lesson of the case. She explains that the courtroom exists because silence, avoidance, and denial failed outside of it. DNA testing succeeded where memory and testimony could not. This reinforces the idea that evidence, not emotion, anchors justice. Yet she also emphasizes that evidence alone does not repair relationships, actions do. The final statements address the children at the center of the disputes. Judge Lake makes it clear that they are not responsible for adult conflict, doubt, or mistakes. She states that every child deserves consistency, honesty, and care, regardless of how complicated their origins may be. This moment brings together the legal and moral dimensions of the case, reinforcing why paternity court matters. In closing, Judge Lauren Lake formally adjourns the court, marking the legal end of the proceedings. However, the description makes clear that the personal consequences will continue beyond the courtroom. Truth has been delivered, records corrected, and responsibilities defined. What remains is the choice each individual makes in response. This final segment completes the courtroom narrative by showing how the law delivers answers while leaving room for personal accountability and growth. It explains not only what decisions were made, but why they matter. Through structured evidence, DNA testing, and judicial guidance, the court transforms years of uncertainty into clarity, demonstrating how justice operates when truth is finally allowed to speak.